Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Ritika, Senior Scientist at the Center for Brain and Mind. The CBM is a collaborative research center, a partnership between two premier institutes in Bangalore, focused around understanding the biology of mental illnesses, both in terms of causes of disease as well as treatment mechanisms. We conduct webinars frequently on various topics, and we'll share the link of past webinars in the chat, and please feel free to check it out at your leisure. Today's event is part of a collaboration between NIMHANS and University of Oslo, funded by the University Grants Commission in India and the Directorate for Higher Education and Skills in Norway, to develop joint education and training programs on various topics in precision psychiatry. Our focus today is going to be on ethical perspectives. And before we get started, just a couple quick housekeeping rules. Please keep your mics on mute and cameras turned off. As and when you have questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat, and we'll take them, as many of them as we can, during the course of the event. I'll now turn it over to Professor Biju, who's your host for this evening.
Next slide, please. Hello. Okay, so we'll start off the event. So I'm Biju Vishwanath. I'm a psychiatrist at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, and I work in the area of genetics and stem cells. In terms of clinical work, I deal with patients with a lot of these major mental illnesses. In terms of research interests, we have established longitudinal family-based clinical cohorts, psychiatric large genetic studies in psychiatry, biorepositories of mental illness, which we have established over the last many years. And of course, we also work with stem cell models and organoids and to try and understand the biology of mental illness. I've been a member of various ethics committees and many other committees. And next slide, please, Anush. So we just start off with a few basic points about research and ethical principles in research. And this is not just true only for genetics and stem cells, but this is just a refresher. So the three key principles are for ethics in research are respect for persons. That is, individuals have to be treated as autonomous agents. And of course, the whole premise of informed consent, which will come up later in the discussions. Beneficence and non-maleficence essentially try to enhance the benefits and reduce the risks. Justice, which is equitability in sharing the burdens and benefits of research. So with that brief intro, I will hand it over to Kara. Excellent.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Biju, for the laying foundations. My name is Kira Staunton. I'm a senior legal and compliance expert at BBMR ERIC, which is the largest federated biobank in the world. We currently have biobanks from 24 member states in the EU and IARC as well, the WHO. I'm also affiliated and a researcher at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, South Africa, and also in the Royal College of Surgeons in Dublin and Ireland. So my research interest and expertise broadly is in the governance of new and emerging technologies, particularly related to biobanks, genomics, and the use of health data. And my research spans both European context and also sub-Saharan Africa, where I've spent about half of my career has been in Cape Town. Next slide, please. So as Biju's talked about the respect for persons, and informed consent is one of the foundational ethical principles. Now, we have three elements of informed consent. Consent needs to be specific, consent needs to be formed, and consent needs to be voluntary. Now, historically, we have had a one study, one informed consent model. So the researcher would come to me, a potential participant, saying, I would like you to enroll you on this study. And I would say, yes, after listening to the risks and benefits of the study, I may decide to participate. With the emergence of biobanks and genomics and the ease in which we can collect, store, use, and reuse biological samples as well as health data, new forms of consent, new models of consent begin to arise. Traditionally, we'd had specific informed consent, but then we saw a move towards broad consent. Because often when researchers are collecting the samples and data, they're not exactly sure for exactly what it is they may want to use the samples and data. So broad consent is when you can broadly consent to categories of research. For example, I may want to consent to metabolic research, or I may want to consent to genetic research. But when you are consenting to that type of research, you're also told about the governance. And so if a research comes to me and asks to collect my samples and data for unspecified future research, they'll also tell me that we will reuse your samples and data subject to perhaps oversight by an ethics committee or a data access committee. And so you're consenting to the unspecified future use, but also the governance and how your samples and data will be managed. And sometimes broad consent is known as consent to governance. There are, however, some who argue that because you don't know exactly what you're consenting to, exactly what the research project is, broad consent is not exactly informed consent. And so we had another type of consent model which has emerged, which is adopted quite commonly in Ireland, where I am from, which is tiered consent. You will give your participant a range of consenting preferences, which they may say yes, no. They may say yes to doing research in X, but no to perhaps data sharing. And then we have dynamic consent. And dynamic consent is a form of consent in which researchers will use information technology, for example, a mobile app, a website, or some other mHealth application in which they can continue to engage with participants. It is a two-way system, and I'm happy to take questions on. I worked for a biobank in the north of Italy for 5 years, in which we have been using dynamic consent for 13 years. And the value of that is you can continue to update participants of what their samples and data have been used for. But also, if there's a new project of which you don't have the consent to, you can easily engage, get in contact with participants and explain the research and get their consent. So we currently have various models of consent which a researcher and a research institution can decide to adopt. Now, one is not more ethical over the other, and the ethical acceptability of the consent models is very much or is very much context specific. What is important is the information that is provided to participants. At a minimum, they should be told, the governance arrangement, how specific the research project is to the extent that you can tell them, the risks and benefits both to the individual and the participants, which is also important in genomics research, any potential for stigma, discrimination, and also if you're going to return results. And these are all topics that I'm happy to come back to in the Q&A, and I will now hand it over to the next speaker.
You can have Rosie.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Next slide, please. Oh, okay. I think it was submitted. Oh, maybe next one. Okay, so I can introduce myself. So I'm Rosario Sassi. I'm a lawyer and a bioethicist. I direct the Institute for Bioethics and Health Policy at the Miller School of Medicine at the University of Miami, where I'm an associate professor of genetics. My background is heavily on stem cell research and regenerative medicine. And for the past 4 years or more, I lost count, I chair the International Society for Stem Cell Research Ethics Committee and a number of other organizations that work in this area between genetics and precision medicine and stem cell research. Next slide, please. What I would like to highlight today is to just give you a very simple, pragmatic framework when we try to address the ethics of stem cell research. When we talk about the ethics of stem cell research, just the consent that Dr. Stanton had mentioned could have been a whole year seminar because of all the nuances. So in this practical framework, I would just to focus on 6 questions I would like every researcher to ask. First, is it simple enough, right? What is this research worth doing? Mostly people forget the scientific justification when people, I said, stakeholders, whether researchers, whether IRB members, whether the public in general, forget the scientific justification. It's not only a technical issue, it's not only a scientific issue that challenge the researcher, the investigator, to show compelling rationale, rigorous design, clear social value, and relevance to human health or social needs for the study they are proposing, but it's also an ethical imperative. And a study will not be ethical if it does not have scientific justification. I'm happy to involve much and to pinpoint that there is a publication that came last year from ISSCR on this topic. The second question is, where did the cells and data come from? Seems simple. It is not that simple. Have been the ethics consultant for HESPREC, the European Stem Cell Registry, and EBIS, the European Bank of Pluripotent Stem Cells, for decades. And one of the most challenging questions we always get is provenance and consent. So first, how the materials are obtained responsibly with valid consent. But the issue is always, what is the scope of the consent? When the individuals donated the materials to derive the stem cell line and for secondary uses, what we call downstream uses of those samples of lines or the derivatives that are generated from those lines. So think about not only I got the sample, I derived the cell line, but all these downstream uses. And also think that it's not only the sample, it's always important that data associated with that sample. And that being the donated biomaterial, the pluripotent stem cell lines, and the derivatives. Another question I will ask is, how this study be affected beyond the immediate participant? What I'm saying here is not only the privacy considerations that we are used to assess, and there are a dimension of autonomy in the consent, but also with the issues of identification. And I'm happy to send later some articles that in point of how pluripotent stem cell lines, even when we think they are anonymized, can still have a potential for be linked through the donors. Familiar and community interest, long-term implications of creating, as I said before, these enduring cell lines and linked data sets. Next slide, please. So the next three questions evolve from the previous ones. So first, when we talk about scientific justification and consent, and I said that we should cover downstream uses, a question that I would like to separate is, does your research involve the creation of models or applications that society, investigators, or the donors could consider ethically sensitive? What I mean by that, the creation, for example, of stem cell embryo models from not integrated to integrated models. That means how much they really resemble a real human embryo. Advanced organoids, human amniotic chimera, derivative gametes, genome editing. You will understand this type of research before we have somatic cell nuclear transfer or cloning. So why this is important? Because it might challenge the scope of the consent, but also we dictate what type of proportional governance is required and how there will be clear defined limits. ISSCR in the last guidelines have a very neat graphic that explains to you the levels of oversight that are required for different type of research. Again, this is not only a technical governance issue, this is an ethical issue. Finally, is clinical translation truly justified? What I'm saying is this innovation pathway that goes from as simple as how do you sign your study, scientific justification, how you obtain the biomaterials, how you derive the lines, and all the way to clinical translation. And in fact, how it is reasonable, this progression towards human use, and then the amount of robust preclinical evidence and risk-benefit assessment that will need it, avoiding hype, avoiding unproven stem cell interventions being sold as or portrayed as already state-of-the-art. And finally, something very important, who bears the risk and who benefits? Here, justice and public trust. This is the beneficence. This is the non-maleficent principles that it was highlighted before, that how we should promote with this research fair participation, equitable access, minimal engagement with patients and communities. So my take-home message is that remember that responsible innovation requires ethical reflection and mandates you to think through the whole translational cycle or research cycle. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We will next move on to Mira.
Right. So I'm sitting here in NIMHANS with Dr. Biju and Ritika. So NIMHANS is a large referral center in South India, which sees patients with neurosurgery, neurology, and neuropsychiatric problems. So about 25 years ago, many of the faculty at the hospital decided that they needed to understand the genetics of the disorders that they were treating. And we decided to set up the molecular genetics lab in the Department of Psychiatry. So over the past 25 years or so, we have collected a large number of samples, about 40,000 or so. These are part of PhD theses, MD theses, national and international grants and studies, many of them still ongoing. Having done a bit of genetics, we decided to also offer clinical testing services. So we do diagnostic testing for some of the disorders, including SCA 1, 2, 3, FRDA, Huntington's disease, etc. So most of us, the genetics that we remember from school is the Punnett square, where everything is black and white, and you expect one gene to give rise to one phenotype. Unfortunately, most of the common disorders that we encounter in as humans and people don't follow that kind of inheritance. That includes severe mental illness. On the other side, the single gene disorders that I was talking about, most people who are from these families have figured out that this is genetic and it runs in families because they would have seen it being inherited from father to son or mother to daughter. But sometimes they have severe misconceptions based on what their own familial experience was, that it's linked to the blood group or it depends on the gender of the parent and things like that, which are often completely wrong. So we have experienced both ends of this spectrum of genetics in terms of neuropsychiatry, and we've been trying to learn along the way on how to educate the patient population and take them along in our research studies. So these are some of the points that we encounter routinely. So like I mentioned, in diagnostics, we have single gene testing. A new frontier now is clinical exome sequencing, where blood is tested, or the DNA is tested of patients, and you search the entire genome to look for genes that could possibly be responsible. More often than not, you don't find anything. And more patients come now to the hospital with a genetic report of a clinical exome. There are terms like VUS and things like that, which they don't know what to make of it. And we as clinicians have to try and explain to them what it might mean or not mean. Most of the time, it doesn't mean anything. And another thing that we encounter quite often in the research arena is when you find incidental findings. That's another thing I think that we will discuss in our presentation today as to how we deal with this.
Thank you, Mira. Anant?
Yeah, hi everyone. Good evening. Thank you for this opportunity to colleagues at CBM NIMHANS and the collaborating institutions. So I think you've already heard about some critical ethics, equity considerations in the fields of genomics, stem cell research, and precision psychiatry. So I thought I'll bring in some perspectives and experiences from India, some of the work that we have ourselves been doing, and also the explorations around ethics and equity. I think it's relevant here to maybe preface these comments by saying that I think all of us recognize the promise of these technologies and how they are also in many ways important translational progress, in terms of what we are doing from a scientific perspective. And hence, we all are trying to find ways to support it. That having been said, it's also important as we progress in science to recognize key governance, oversight issues, ethics issues, and equity issues. And I think today's conversation will hopefully allude to some of these. Yeah. If you could go to the next slide, please. So, as we see these emerging technologies, one has to recognize that part of where the challenge lies, especially in LMIC conditions or contexts like ours, is where is that evidence and around applications, around utility benefits and clinical integration, right? And some of this work, of course, is happening at tertiary care centers of excellence like NIMHANS, but there needs to be a lot more done in diverse contexts like ours. Part of the reason for that is that there is a strong issue of how patients and families which are impacted look at science and look at how science is communicated, right? And a lot of this work is, for example, led by clinicians, and there can be the issue of therapeutic misconception, where patients and families might not understand that what is being discussed is experimental medicine. It's an intervention which is still being developed and evaluated, and they might confuse it for clinical advice or a clinical intervention, right? And this is what is important for us to recognize and keep always in mind, because you might be a clinician, but at that point of time, when you are recruiting someone into a clinical experimental study, do they really understand that you are coming at it from a researcher perspective, right? And are we able to communicate to them the potential risk benefits, the chances that this intervention might not work, right? So that I feel is a key issue here. We also need to recognize that many of the contexts that we work in have a lot of diversity, right? There is linguistic diversity. There is also a range of literacy which exists. There might be a lot of individuals who might not have low literacy levels. There are socio-cultural factors, there are financial aspects, all of which influence decision making, and all of which are hence also interrelated with consent discussions, right? Because consent, as I think the prior speakers also alluded to, is not a one-time form signing activity. It is an ongoing engagement and a process which sort of translates to this kind of a conversation which needs to continue all throughout your engagement with the potential research participant, or even potentially a person who might be receiving a clinical intervention. Now, if you layer on the fact that there is this whole issue of probability, there is issues around genomic risks, and then, how do you communicate that in a way that it is accessible, that the person is not just getting the information, but also able to understand it and then decide on their own whether this is something that they are willing to partake in, right? So that I feel is still an important consideration for institutions, for researchers, and for regulators as well as ethics committees, right? And any role that you might be playing in this context hence needs to look at this closely. We also need to recognize that there is still, of course, a fair bit of stigma around mental health conditions, and when you again bring in these kinds of technologies and the kind of stratification risks which might be there, then you might reinforce some level of social labeling or blame. And that can have implications for the individuals. These could have implications on their families. There are gendered aspects here as well, especially the impact for women might be even higher in terms of what that could mean for their families and how they're treated by their families, both families that they're born into and families that they might marry into, for example, if they would choose to. So something again which is crucial from a cultural context. Next slide. Yeah, so I mean, I think when you look at the Indian context specifically, when we say that in our consent forms that we are offering protections around privacy, we are offering protections around confidentiality. We often say that we will only work with data or share data which is anonymized. I think that's becoming more and more difficult to imagine or even do as genomic data becomes increasingly available and used, and also with large scale data banks, where I think anonymization now is universally understood to be something which might not be possible from an absolutist perspective, right? Because there is always the possibility that you might be able to create linkages, you might be able to identify individuals, and by extension, their families, etc. So that is something for us to keep in mind. And of course, how do we communicate around these kinds of newer developments in science? Because of course, we know that from an ethics perspective, our guidelines, the requirements around open science, etc., require us to talk about science from a transparent perspective, from an accountability perspective, and from a non-exploitation risk minimization perspective, which also brings in the equity issue, right? In the sense, who are the patients who are involved in these kinds of interventions? Who are the individuals who are involved in the research, which is leading to the development of these interventions? And for example, is research happening on those who might be coming from socioeconomically deprived backgrounds, whereas the technologies once available are largely accessible for those who might be socioeconomically well off and who never contributed from participating in the research perspective, but are now able to leverage from the evidence which is being generated. And is that something which is problematic from a justice perspective? The ethics guidance, as many of you would have seen, I think some of the guidelines were distributed prior to the webinar. The guidance documents take time to develop, and these frameworks then become available, but the science which the frameworks are trying to be applied to is rapidly evolving, right? So if you look at the field of genomics, gene editing, synthetic biology, CRISPR, Cas9, for example, we've seen so much progress happen in literally a few years, right? And so are our ethical frameworks nimble enough to be able to keep pace with the technology and the development of the kind of scientific applications that we have? And if not, what do we need to be doing differently, right? Because we can look up to our regulators and to national policymakers, but we also need to recognize that as researchers, as institutions, as clinicians, we need to keep some of these core tenets of ethics which have been spoken to in mind, right? Because ultimately you can have great guidelines, but unless you apply them, unless you own them, and unless you implement them as researchers and as investigators and as clinicians, they can stay great on paper, but not necessarily, there might not be a meaningful engagement with them on the ground. So that's something for us to keep in mind. It's also important to recognize that commercial entities do exist in this domain. You have a lot of organizations, institutions, companies already offering services. And while some of this might be evidence-based, there is probably a lot out there which is just overselling. And a lot of this is now direct to consumer advertising, right? In the newspaper, in your email boxes, in your neighborhood clinics, etc., which advertises a service which says, send us a sample and we'll send you a whole report which tells you about disease risk analysis, which tells you about what kind of personal decisions you should be making without necessarily informing or providing evidence that whatever they are claiming is actually based on on science. So that's something which there is a little bit of a regulatory gap also around, and something for us to think about. Of course, a lot of technology now also involves the use of AI and LLM based models, and India is the leader, of course, in this space. But again, the usage and governance frameworks as they are emerging, we will need to keep a close watch in terms of ensuring that we are able to stay on top, stay engaged. And as I said right in the beginning, the idea here is not to police the technology. The idea is not here to be a barrier to the technology. But the whole idea is around how we can promote the responsible use of technology while ensuring that we minimize risk, maximize benefits, and that we support communities, including researchers, clinicians, patients, families, in being able to leverage the promise of the technology and minimize any exploitation or misuse which might exist. I'll stop here. Thank you. Sorry, I just realized I had one more slide. Just quickly on the equity issue, a lot of the databases, as we all know, there is a heavy reliance on Western genomic or the global North-based databases, and this might limit the diagnostic accuracy when applied for Indian populations. As I said earlier, also there is an equity issue around who's able to access these technologies and the gap which exists, because India's health system, for example, is also very mixed. You have the public sector, you also have a large private sector where some of these technologies are available but at a fairly high cost. And of course, this key important issue around benefit sharing. And we're seeing this play out globally right now with the PABS agreement, right? The pathogen access and benefit sharing discussions which are happening, where this has been a chronic issue which we have not been able to solve in global health. How do we ensure that benefit sharing is at the core of discussions around sharing of genomic data and expectations around open science? And is that really equitable? So hopefully we'll see more progress in this domain as well. Otherwise, we will continue to see maybe inequitable and exploitative examples of so-called collaborations between the global North and the global South. Thank you.
Thank you, Anand. I think people can start typing questions. We will obviously take up discussions, but then in between, if I can plug in a question, I will. So I think we will start with one opening question for all panelists, which I think people can think of. So one is, from your experience and in your area, what are some of the enduring and emerging debates on ethics in your area? So what would be one thing that, what would be an enduring thing? What would be an emerging thing that you may want to highlight? Maybe I will start with Meera and ask her first. So.
Enduring and emerging. So, like I mentioned in my introduction, we've been doing diagnostics for many of these single gene disorders. So, as you know, if it is a single gene disorder, the process is to first counsel the patient and make sure they understand what it means if they do turn out to have a mutation for that disorder. But what it also would mean is that if they are positive, their siblings could be at risk, their children would be at risk. So this is a big problem. And when we look at the adult onset disorders, it becomes even more complicated, because by the time a patient realizes that he or she is carrying a mutation, they would have already had a family and children. So it's a very big problem when a spouse comes across and says, hey, they never told us that my husband carries this risk gene. My father-in-law didn't look normal during the wedding, but they kept this information from us. So these are very, very difficult questions for which there are no answers, because in a country like India, where the government does not really take care of somebody who has a neurodegenerative condition, if you're the parent of a child who is likely to have a disorder, would you rather marry her off and hope that there's a 50% chance that her husband might look after her, versus nobody is there to look after her at all? So what is ethically right or wrong in these kind of situations is very difficult to tease out. So that is one end of the spectrum. The other is when the emerging part of this kind of problem is when you have situations where you have IVF and people have the choice of selecting an embryo to implant. So I'm told that people are actually doing clinical exomes and trying to find out which is a better configuration of genes to implant. Fine, if you have 10 embryos and you want to make a choice, you want to have some kind of a yardstick to make this choice. But it is so scary that these kind of things are even being done in the real world today. The clinical exome sequencing is another big Pandora's box, because there is very rarely do you get an actionable gene that helps the patient, but it is being prescribed more and more confused patients and clinicians have these clinical exome reports that they are trying to figure out. Like Anand, previously mentioned, a lot of these databases are full of European and probably some East Asian data. Indian data is very largely in the private sector, because a lot of sequencing initial years happened in the private sector. But I must say that a lot of hospitals like NIMHANS have also started doing this kind of clinical exome sequencing now, and there are databases available where even government hospitals can dip in and look for what is the chance of a particular variant being pathogenic or not in our own population. So that database is slowly building. It's going to take time, but hopefully it will get better going forward.
Thank you. So what I will do is I will use that to kickstart a discussion in some form. So I think there was some discussion about testing and in families. Maybe Kara, maybe you can take this up a little if you want to discuss a different context. Meera was talking about an Indian context and what happens here. So would you want to do that?
Biju, would you mind just repeating that again?
Yeah, so the Meera's discussion about, let's say, a diagnosis in the family, a genetic diagnosis in the family, how it has implications for the family members, and people come for testing, and how do you decide what to and how to go about it? Is that something you can discuss from a different perspective from what you're seeing?
For sure. So one of the kind of hats that I wear is I'm involved in the Genome of Europe project through the Genome of Ireland. and I'm leading the ELSI work package, co-leading the ELSI work package for the Genome of Ireland. And just to kind of give you some context, within Ireland, we are looking simply to collect samples from 1,200 participants and sequence the data. 200 participants of that is to be members of the travelling population, which is an underrepresented minority and historically disenfranchised and stigmatized population in Ireland. Within that project, we still have an ongoing issue, and this kind of relates to your enduring and emerging issue, whereas I think returning results is both an enduring and ongoing issue that we are facing. We haven't reached consensus on what we are going to do, but one of the issues that has come up is that if I enroll a participant into the research study and an incidental finding comes up, how do I act? What is the responsibility to communicate that to a family member? Now, there is case law in the UK in the clinical context that if a patient is diagnosed with something, there may be a duty of care to communicate that to family members. But in the research context, it is a little bit different. And so there is no answer. We have not, the perspective of the research team within the Genome of Ireland is that we don't have a responsibility to the family member. If there is a responsibility at all, it is to the individual. But it is kind of bring to the fore this debate between, on the one hand, protection of privacy, we need to protect the privacy of the individual, but then how do we communicate that to family members of which there may be a significant impact on their health? No answer, but just kind of reflections on something that we are experiencing within the Irish context.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to discuss? Anant, maybe a patient perspective. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things here. One, I think, building on what Meera said, is that in the practice of medicine and healthcare, we know that, one of the challenges we have is a strong sense of paternalism, right? Which is that the doctor knows best, the healthcare team knows best, and sort of a lot of assumptions and decision making, sometimes also from the patient and family side, centering the healthcare providers' views and opinions, right? And if we are not able to engage, communicate, inform, and perhaps have a way of patients and families to be able to deal with some of this complexity, then maybe we will not have the kind of public and community engagement that we need in this space. The other issue is an important moral issue, right? If you use technology and you identify a condition, is it okay to just communicate and say, here is a diagnosis or here is a label for you, but sorry, we don't have anything to offer you in terms of a clinical intervention or something which could legitimately respond to what we have labeled you with, right? And this is not unique to the kind of technologies we are speaking to. We did an analysis when XDR and MDR TB testing was being scaled up in India, especially at the district level. And this was an important issue. Is it for the health system an ethical choice to introduce testing for a condition such as drug-resistant TB when you don't have services for drug-resistant TB, especially in the public sector, right? So is it ethical to provide a technology which tests you for a condition and then not provide services or treatment for that condition? And maybe some element of that is also with the use of technologies, right? So when we offer technological testing and then offer a label or a diagnosis, do we have an ethical obligation to also then support the family, the patient, the extended community with the follow-up implications of that diagnostic label that we have given them, right? And what does that mean, right? Does that mean that working with the patients and communities to build a response to that? As Meera was saying, some of the treatment choices can be fairly expensive if they exist. There might be a lack of services or a lack of research which is happening, but then there is some good news, right? There are examples, for example, from in the rare disease community, there are examples from long COVID where patient-led advocacy has meant that more funding has become available, including in countries like India, right? So can we work in isolation in these kinds of bubbles where we say, no, our job is only to do research or clinical work? Or do we then also need to work with advocates, work with communities, work with patients and their families to be able to respond to a better use of the technologies, but then also being able to leverage technologies and support them in decision making and the kind of services that they might require once conditions are identified. Oh,
Thank you, and Rosie.
Thank you. I would like to go back to a very interesting issue that was posed is what is the ethical, even if not the moral duty of an individual to disclose health information that will material for a decision in life, right? You mentioned about the marriage, there's cultural aspects there, there's societal aspects there. So what I would say is, and following Dr. Stoughton's also response, is that we can maybe to start this ethical thinking of process is borrow from what occurs in the clinical setting, in the genomic setting, what we call an emerging ethical, if not legal, in some jurisdictions, duty to warn. So to alert somebody when a result, when a genetic result, for example, a medical result is actionable, is clinical actionable, meaning where there's an intervention that could be used to prevent or ameliorate a disease outcome. So we are talking about, for example, when somebody inherits little disease, let's say the Huntington gene that is very present, and whether there's a duty of a relative to disclose a duty of the patient to disclose to the relatives that they're the carrier of a pathogenic disorder that could express an agent. So for this, where we have, and I have worked in this area, what we have is that even in many countries, this has this emergence through the course of a legal duty to act, to say something. But so far, it has not pushed the envelope to say doctors should violate confidentiality. That's a sacred duty. So what we refrain in is that this duty to warn is satisfied when a doctor, in this case could be the researcher, informs the individual of the familial risk and encourage and provides means to disclose this information. So I think that is an aspect that we can rescue here to say this is how the ethical dimension could be addressed. Encourage the disclosure, and that way is assisting in explaining what it means. That sometimes is not a fatalistic result, that is not a deterministic result. But it's complicated when they have these other social implications. Thank you.
Oh, you're muted.
Oh, no, I thank you. Oh, Karen, yeah.
Thanks. So we just want to circle back to something Anand said about, what exactly we should be returning. And as Anand correctly pointed out, there is traditionally paternalistic attitude within the medical and research profession. And this is an attitude that continues to prevail even to this day. Some are worse than others, some are better than others. But I want to give you some reflections from engagement we did with a project called the Facilitate Project, which was involved in that just finished last month. So Facilitate was an IHI project, which is a European Commission funded project in which you have an engagement, a collaboration between industry, academia, and patient organization. It can work very well. It can be a little bit difficult because of who it is that you're engaging with. Our project was involved in two things, but was focused on two things. But one of those was the return of individual participant data. And throughout the 4.5 years, the key question was, okay, we're developing processes of how you do. We're thinking about the kind of platform that we would develop. But the key question is, what data are we returning? And pharma very much want to say if it has clinical utility. Whereas the patients were like, no, utility isn't just clinical utility. It comes also to the personal utility. I want to know, okay, yes, it may not be clinically actionable, but it may help me make decisions in my reproductive choices or other life choices and so forth. And I think this is something that, in particularly in Ireland, there's very much a reluctance to return anything. And it comes back to this fear, paternalistic attitudes that they're going to fear patients, when I think they're failing to realize patients and participants are often incredibly well informed, They know what they're asking for. They know what they're getting for what information they're going to get. And simply, they just want to know. And the question is, in that kind of context, if they just want to know, should we, not just be giving it to them, and making sure that there are the structures such as genetic counseling and so forth in place. So it's something that, we had to balance it in our final clinical guideline, which I think is being published in a couple of weeks. But it was something that we had to balance, this kind of notion between clinical utility and personal utility in making a final decision on what we will return.
Sure. So on that note, I will jump ships and ask about the next thing that Meera told. It was about selection of embryos and the ethics of it. So maybe Rosie, maybe you will be the right person to start off this.
Well, I think it's a very complicated question, the selection of embryos. So, but there's long-standing, I would say, ethical best practices and even legal best practices on when and if selecting an embryo is scientifically, clinical, and ethical appropriate. And how it goes is, it depends, right? In some cases, what is frowned upon is selecting just for gender or sex, right? And when there's not a clinical indication, I'm not talking on X-linked disorders, and we select them for health conditions. And then the debate goes forever. What do we mean by health conditions, right? How penetrant is the disorder of the gene? Are we doing for prevention? And we're doing for neurotherapeutic reasons. So this is a very open, and I would say it's an enduring debate. We thought we'd resolve it, my God, like 20-something years ago when we started talking about genetic engineering and cloning, but we had not resolved. Technology kept pushing back and said, when and if. And I think what the society has to come up with a clear answer. I think we're pushing towards no, unless there's a clear clinical indication and the benefits and risk are very proportional. But the slippery slope of going for, let's say, editing for Huntington disease. But now we said, are we going to edit because we think that manic depression as genetics or schizophrenia, where we have identified certain pathogenic variants and this, and then we keep going and going and going. Where are we going to end, right? Do we edit so our skin color is different, our height? And I don't even let me talk about intelligence and all those things that some people propose we can think with gene editing.
There was also this whole thing about using CRISPR and changing embryos, right? Which also came up. So do you also want to touch? Yeah.
Yeah, with CRISPR, depends. Is in a way, I think should be technological agnostic, the debate, because we talk CRISPRs and then we have primer editing and we keep pushing the envelope and we have gene therapies now. And I invite everybody to look at very powerful coverage today in Science magazine about a gene therapy trial that tried to use CRISPR to create to address Rett syndrome in a 6-year-old, and unfortunately the 6-year-old this little human being passed away. And that's what I'm saying is it should be technological and agnostic. The question should say when and if it is appropriate, and that appropriateness has different layers.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add anything to this, or shall we move on? Okay, so we have some participant questions, so let me start with some of those. So I think maybe I'll just direct this to Kara. So I think the question is, how ethical is it if a patient consents to a study without knowing the full implications of the study? So that's the question asked.
Well, as one of the elements of informed consent is that it is informed, and as part of that, participants should understand. Generally, there should be an assessment, some sort of an assessment at the time of consent to ensure that the participant does understand. This was formalized, I think, in the HIV trials in South Africa, where they had to actually do some sort of a test. But the problem is the science is very complicated. I'm a highly educated woman. I've been working in this space for 15 years. I work with genomics researchers all the time, and I really haven't a clue what they do half the time. And if it's going to be difficult for me to understand, how is it going to be possible for someone who A, may not have the same level of education, or B, the same exposure to the science? But just because it's difficult doesn't mean that we should ignore this understanding. There are means and ways in which you can ensure that there is a sufficient level of understanding. During my postdoc, I was fortunate to be involved in the H3 Africa project, which is the Human Hereditary and Health in Africa project, a 10-year project funded by Wellcome and NIH, for those who don't know, about scaling up capacity for genomics and biobanks research in Africa. And there was a huge ELSI component, which was fantastic. And a lot of work there was done on community engagement. And one of the projects, for example, was a collaboration from University in Botswana and Baylor College. They actually produced a series of comic books, which was targeted at children to help them understand the basics of genomics research. The grant that I had, which was on community engagement as a model as a mechanism which to govern for biobanks, we also developed some videos which we used then to inform our participants and ensure that we could have conversations with our community advisory board. Another project from UWC in South Africa, they had developed a playbook. So there are mechanisms to ensure that we can help increase health literacy. And I think health literacy is something that we should continue to come back all the time, both in the clinical context, but also in the research context. And increasingly, if we are going to move towards more dynamic consent or digital tools, we also need to start looking at digital literacy in conjunction with our health literacy. So to some, it is difficult, but it's important that we continue to make the efforts and share our experiences with each other in the different contexts to ensure that we can learn from each other and figure out like some best practices and some resources that we can adapt to our own context.
Thank you. I'll take up the next question. So this maybe I will direct to Anand. I think this is specifically about the Digital Personal Data Protection Act. The question is whether, so essentially it is to protect the personal data, whether this will improve the public health trust in mental health research, or do you think it will create barriers? So that's the question.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. As we all know, the DPDP rules are now under implementation, and there are deadlines coming up later this year and around the middle of the next year when these will become, you have to basically implement them at the institutional level, right? And so the whole idea of data principles, data fiduciaries, and sort of consent intermediaries, all of those will become operational. I think it is certainly probably a paradigm change process right now. We'll have to see how this plays out. But the fact that now increasingly the idea is to use digital technologies in a way that can allow for the need for explicit consenting at every level, right? And this also, of course, from a research perspective, would mean that you would really need to not just take consent, but also document it and demonstrate it, right? And the idea that that consent could be withdrawn at any point of time, and the onus on ensuring that those processes exist and those pathways are available will lie with the researchers, their institutions, and all of that consent architecture which is being built up, right? So it does strengthen the idea of consent, at least conceptually, but operationally, how this will play out, what this would mean, and how do we ensure that people are able to understand what their rights are and use it in a way that it allows for decisions to be taken with concurrence and with adequate information. We'll have to wait and see. So my sense is probably I feel that institutions are not really preparing themselves adequately. I think most institutions have not even started thinking about how this is going to impact clinical care or patient care if they are clinical institutions, and or research implementation for research institutions, and they really need to start looking into the implications of not being ready come the November deadline and the May next year deadline. So yeah, I think there's going to be probably an intermediary painful process of adoption, but hopefully after that there will be clearer pathways. Though I feel that again, a lot of this is about digital data, and not everyone has access to digital means. We will still need to have mechanisms which allow for those where divide already exists and will continue to exist, so that they don't get left out just because you have digital means of engagement. Oh.
Kiara?
Yeah, hi. So I'm just going to offer some, I'm conscious of the time, very quick reflections in other contexts, because a huge amount of my work is the implementation of data protection regulations into the research context. And a couple of comments. One, it does formalize things. You know, institutions do have to comply with this. There are generally heavy fines. And so once they begin to catch up, for example, South Africa was very slow in implementing its regulation. It only came into force in 2021, which is in the middle of the pandemic, which was not ILD. But it is important because it formulates processes and patients are aware and participants are aware of their rights. The problem I see is that there is a kind of a cooling or chilling effect of these laws. And often the implementation is so risk averse that it actually restricts data sharing, which is problematic both for patient care and also for research. So for any clinicians or institutions that are here on the call, I would really strongly encourage you to remember that these data protection regulations are about the protection of personal data. They're not about the restriction. They're about the ensuring that you can, when you share data, and they encourage you to share data, that you do it in a manner that does protect personal data. And on that, unfortunately, I need to bow out and jump to my next call.
We'll give it the last, maybe the last question to Rosie, if you can take one. This is about the ethics of organoid research, stem cell organoids, and would you want to take that up? Ethical challenges in stem cell-based organoid research.
So that is a very long, very broad question. What I will say, the ethics of organoid research I will say, go back to the 6 practical questions, right? And will consider sensitive issue research. What are the uses? Organoid research, if you talk brain organoids, there's issues about sentience, about thinking and feeling, and more great. And if we talk about organoids to reconstruct for disease modeling, is less ethical sensitive. The level of oversight is proportional to that. Consent for just the derivation or organoids is important. Whether and this is, I'm gonna close this probably to say, this is one question that is, or one issue that is the both enduring and both emerging. And it's that, how do we deal with emerging technologies? How do we deal with retrospective collections? A donor already have donated biosamples for stem cell derivation. A stem cell line had already been created. That the scope of the consent includes organoid research, and organoid research could be a number of issues. That is the uses, and whether the governance bodies are fit for purpose for that particular study. So what is the level? More oversight, expedient review, in the category of prohibited activities. And I will encourage you to look at the ISSCR stem cell research guidelines, which have a whole section on organoid research, is linked with the ethical aspects and the governance.
Thank you. And we are running out of time, so I will give it back to the organizer.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you to all our panelists for joining us today. There was so much on this topic, and we were only able to scratch the surface of it. That's unfortunately the nature of the issue. But to those whose questions we could not answer, if you would like, you please send us an email and we will try to get back to you. If you could just take a couple seconds, we have on the screen feedback, just a couple of questions to let us know how we're doing and how you found this session. As I mentioned at the beginning of the session, we do webinars on a regular basis. So check out our website and find us on social media channels for our next event, which for those of you who are based in Bangalore is on the 31st. It's an in-person event on how genes and environment shape mental illnesses. So we hope to see you there and on our future events. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for the invitation. Take care.